gonna have some fun.
We get what we can now and take the rest later. We play the long game. My man Kanan used to say, every good lie is veiled in the truth.
This Chicago, these are streets.
Death predictions, characters ending up in jail, or what rarely happens in the world of power, characters riding off into the sunset, or rather having to leave because they've lost everything, lost loved ones, lost their family, business, and friends. That's the topic of today's breakdown, because I do think there will be a very mixed ending for a lot of these characters. I think a lot will end up dead, but I do think a few will end up in prison, and a few will end up escaping. In the sense, they leave Chicago, or are forced to leave Chicago. Gary Lennon's already teased there are a lot of ways this could actually play out. So we're going to be looking at death predictions across the board for the final season of Force, now that they've given us a lot to work with in terms of interviews from Gary Lennon and Joseph Sikora. We are still in for a lot more interviews, and I'm expecting them to be released more closer to 7th of November. But now that we've got some information from Gary Lennon and Joseph Sikora, now that we've seen the official trailer, along with a few more teasers that have been floating around, I do think it's the perfect time to discuss who dies, who survives, who goes to prison, and who could be leaving Chicago. So let's dive into some death predictions, starting with the funeral scene that we saw in the official trailer, who I personally believe is JP. Now, before the trailer was released, Gary Lennon did mention there would be something that would bring Tommy Egan to his knees. Lo and behold, we actually saw that moment in one of the teasers that was recently released, and it's probably the moment where Tommy gets the call that JP is gone. And based on everything else that we've seen in the trailer, he is 100% on my death predictions list going into the last season, and he is high on the list for a number of reasons. I do think Tommy will eventually win this war in Chicago. However it pans out, whoever the alliances and coalitions are with, whatever happens with Maria, Miguel Garcia, the Marquez cartel, the CBI, eventually I do think Tommy will be the one who comes out on top. But we know in power there is always a cost. There is always a price that needs to be paid by the time you become the king. We can go all the way back to scenarios such as Tommy and Ghost killing Breeze. He was a sacrifice. After Breeze, Ghost sent Kanan to prison. Along the way, they've also lost countless of loved ones, business associates, and partners. For example, Tommy lost Liliana in season 1. People just get caught in the crossfire when things get really heated in the moment. And you can be damn sure it's going to be like that in season 3 of Force. Tommy may get the win, he may eventually win the war, but at what cost? Who will he lose in the process? That's number 1. Number 2. I do think after the trailer and a couple of teasers, if anybody had any doubt that this was JP, I do think a few of these scenes do paint the picture. I have recently been rewatching Force, and I actually thought for a second whether this could actually be JP's father's funeral, but he was non-existent in season 2, and I don't think he's actually a character to make such a fuss over. I don't think he's someone who would, in essence, bring Tommy to his knees. You got D-Mac who also looks upset, and behind him you can see pictures of him and JP. You zoom into the funeral scene, it does also look like Kate speaking at the front, so I do think all signs do point towards JP being the one. Number 3. JP's death really would set off D-Mac, not just in Force, but in my opinion, what's to come after, which is Legacy. I do think D-Mac does cross over with Tommy and Tariq. We've all had the bits of Tommy mentoring him through mentioning Kanan. He's going to be teaching him what Kanan once taught him when he was D-Mac's age, and I do think if JP is no longer in the picture, it means Tommy's just going to have to look after him even more. He's going to have to take him under his wing. He's going to have to guide him and mentor him. So you've got all of these narrative and reasons just kind of pointing in the direction of JP. But let's go a little deeper and ask the question, if and when we do see JP's death, who pulls the trigger? If I were to put money on anybody killing JP, at this moment in time, especially after freshly rewatching season 1, if I were to put any money on any character at this moment in time, it just simply has to be Jannard. He was borderline obsessed with Tommy in season 1. He really did want Tommy's head on a spike. The way Jannard was behaving and moving behind Tommy's back even reminded me a lot of how Kane was with Tariq. I can see a scenario where Jannard makes a call behind Diamond's back and goes straight for Tommy. He either kills JP in cold blood, or it's a scenario where he thinks he's shooting at Tommy, but instead he kills JP. I personally don't believe these moves that Jannard is making is going to be in full agreement with Diamond. Diamond is an OG. He has certain ways of doing things, and I think when it comes to Tommy and the organization, they are probably going to clash. And I do think it's probably going to piss Jannard off to the point where he does take shit into his own hands. Again, going back to season 1, that's exactly what he did. Jannard can be very emotional, rash, angry, and aggressive. And we all know when you mix all of them together, you do end up making a lot of mistakes and making some bad calls. So I do have JP high up on my death predictions list, and I do have Jannard pulling the trigger, which would also probably cement his fate as well. But when we get to the CBI section, I am going to run through a scenario where I do think he could end up in jail, but more on that later on. Moving away from JP, the other family members that Tommy has in Chicago are Kate and D-Mac. With D-Mac, I do think he is a character who will survive. I think he's someone who's got a lot more to give, not just in Season 3, but in the kind of wider Power universe. He's definitely got a lot more to learn, and he's someone who I can see teaming up with Tommy and Tariq in Legacy later on. I think he can go a long way with someone like Tommy as a mentor, so for me, D-Mac definitely survives. With Kate, again, she's a Power OG. Personally, I don't have her on my death predictions list. I personally don't think she's going to die in Season 3, but if you really wanted to hit the Power audience with someone unexpected, then Kate would be that character. I just think Tommy's going to do everything in his power to protect his family, especially after going through this. There's no way he lets anything happen to D-Mac and Kate. Even though we know their relationship isn't exactly the best, Kate is still Kate. She's a Power OG. And I personally think by the time Season 3 comes to an end, Tommy will have probably set her up just before he moves on. So, speaking of moving on, let's move on with our death predictions over to the Flynns. Now, going back to another quote from Gary Lennon, he did say that I'm a big believer in ending seasons and ending episodes with a question that we answer in the following episodes. We get right to it right away, and you do get to see a very interesting resolution to that dilemma. Now, the dilemma that he was actually speaking about was actually the Maria situation, but I do think this quote also can be extended to the Claudia Flynn situation. By answering that question in the following episode, is Claudia Flynn dead or alive? In my opinion, if we're getting the answers to Maria in episode 1, then I'm expecting the answers to whether Claudia Flynn is actually dead in episode 1 as well. The reason why I'm very skeptical at this moment in time is because of the history speaking for itself in Power. When it comes to supposed kills or deaths that we haven't seen being confirmed on screen, we know what that can sometimes mean. You go back to Kanan in Season 2, Felipe Lobos, Tatiana also was another who Ghost thought was dead. There was also Lauren in Book 2 Ghost. The most famous from recent times is Unique. So can we all genuinely sit here and say Claudia is dead for sure? Can we honestly say, yep, 100% Claudia Flynn is dead? I honestly don't think we can. I think it's something they have to address in episode 1. They have to tell us that she's dead 100%. We need that confirmation. If for whatever reason we don't get that in episode 1, if in episode 1 and episode 2 passes by and there's no word of Claudia Flynn, there's nothing that's been mentioned about Claudia, or there's some very cryptic messages from law enforcement, that's when I'm probably going to start to warn everyone Claudia's definitely in the wind somewhere, and at some point she is going to be making a return. So I'm kind of on the fence with this one, if I'm going to be totally honest. Until it's confirmed for sure, history has proven we can never jump the gun in Power. So let's just see what information they give us in episode 1. Now with Vic Flynn, we all know he wants out of this messy situation, not just under Stacey Marks, but also under Tommy Egan. Gary Lennon has also teased what Tommy has planned for Vic is going to be a great reveal. And there are a few directions they could actually take his destiny. In my opinion, I think that probably means his character actually does survive. I know it goes against the grain where snitches have to go in the world of Power, but with Vic, I genuinely have the gut feeling where, with what's been teased with the early kind of quotes, he may actually survive. I think he'll help Tommy in the grand scheme of things against his war with Stacey Marks, and also law enforcement. And I think come the end, he would have somewhat redeemed himself. I mean, he'll never be trusted, that's for sure, but I do think he can still be very useful for Tommy, and when he makes his move, I do think Tommy will eventually let him go. Reading between the lines from what Gary Lennon has already teased for Vic's character, he's someone who I can see just leaving Chicago with maybe his new love interest. Not everybody has to die in the world of Power, and we have seen other characters just get up and leave. Symphony in Raising Kanan Season 2 is a classic example. He was able to just leave New York. Definitely different circumstances, but the point still does stand. Not everybody has to die in the world of Power, and as it stands, even though Vic is a snitch, I think he will eventually turn the tables on Stacey Marks and eventually leave Chicago. So far we have JP on our death predictions, Kate and D-Mac surviving. There's a question mark around Claudia Flynn, and for Vic, he leaves Chicago. Now moving on to Miguel and Maria Garcia. Now with Maria, I've kind of got the same thought process as Vic Flynn. Based on history of snitches, we know what happens. I'm still leaning towards Vic surviving. Same thing for Maria. Based on history in terms of previous love interest for Tommy, we know he doesn't have a good track record. But that's why I'm going to lean towards Maria surviving. and her character arc ending a different way to Holly and Lakeisha, their times of charm. In these trailers and teasers that we've seen, we've heard Maria mention that she knows the world that she's in. She knows it's a dangerous world, but she is going to be there by Tommy's side. I think she's probably going to have some close calls and moments where she's going to be in danger. But again, I do think we will see her survive. It's just going to be very interesting to see how all these players around Tommy Egan's world does end up, because if he's going to continue with his journey into Power Legacy, where does it leave characters like Maria? Does she go with him? Does she stay in Chicago? Will Tommy set her up somewhere before he leaves with Tariq? Could she even be pregnant come the end of Season 3? Does that kind of change the game? I do think there's going to be a lot of moving pieces with this one, but in the grand scheme of things, as things stand at this moment in time, I do have Maria surviving. Now with Miguel Garcia, this one really is a tricky one. I do think everybody knows where I stand in terms of the battle with Tommy Egan. I don't think it's going to last long at all, because I do think they will eventually find a reason to work together. Now, does that mean Miguel survives? Not necessarily. The Insane Princes will always be in some kind of battle with the CBI, especially if Janard is around. He's just a ticking time bomb. But it is a very tricky one with Miguel. I've actually got 2 bullet points written here, where one where he actually survives and one where he doesn't. If I were to pick one of the outcomes that we went through right at the beginning of the breakdown, going with my gut feeling at this moment in time, recording this particular breakdown, I think Miguel does survive. I can see a scenario where Tommy and Miguel team up and where Tommy leaves Chicago to continue his journey with Tariq and also D-Mac in a new city, and that leaves Miguel with the territory in Chicago. But it really is a difficult one with Miguel. Honestly, you can make so many arguments for his death and against his death. I just think they've got so many twists up their sleeve with it being the last season. I just don't think everybody has to die. I could be wrong with the Miguel prediction, but because he's going to be making an alliance with Tommy, I'm probably going against the majority, but I am saying he survives. But that's Miguel and Maria. Let's move on to the CBI. Now, the CBI are definitely going to be facing some big losses within their organization. In the trailers and teasers that we've seen, we can see them pouring a drink out for one or more of their CBI brothers that they may have lost. So I do think there are going to be some numbers that do drop from the CBI side, especially when you're in a war against the Marquez cartel. If you're going up against the cartel, we know they ain't shy when it comes to spilling blood. But what about the 2 brothers at the top, the CBI brothers, Janard and Diamond? With Janard, I do think he is a dead man walking in this final season. Going back to the JP scenario, if he is the one to kill JP, then there's just simply no way he can survive. Tommy's definitely going to get him, maybe even D-Mac gets him, or maybe even both. Just like how we saw Ghost and Tommy kill Milan and Lobos together, maybe D-Mac and Tommy kill Janard together. I mean, go back to the scene where Kate tells Tommy, make them suffer. But regardless of whether Janard kills JP or not, I do think he's going to be acting quite wild in Season 3. If he doesn't kill JP, then maybe he's someone that Tommy could set up to go to prison. Maybe Janard ends up where Diamond started in Force, which is behind bars. We've seen Tommy pull the move with Claudia and the Serbs, and we know law enforcement are going to be on the hunt. I do think they will also kind of get a small win during Season 3. So if Janard isn't the one to kill JP, I wouldn't mind seeing a scenario where he ends up in jail. It would be quite funny to kind of see Tommy just waving at him while Janard goes off in handcuffs. So I'm going to put him in both sections with a question mark. Now with Diamond, this one's a really tricky one. We've spoken about how he's a OG and how he does things different to his younger brother, but they have teased that they are going to be getting back together, and they will be stronger than ever before. And if Janard is killed, does Diamond retaliate? Do we really see a scenario where we see Tommy versus Diamond? Because if we do, again, there can only be one winner. We also have to remember there are a lot of threats like the Marquez cartel and law enforcement. I personally can't see Diamond's story ending up with him being arrested. Correct me if I'm wrong, I do believe he was inside for 15 years, and if one of the CBI brothers were to end up behind bars, I do think Janard is probably more likely than Diamond. But with it being the final chapter in Chicago, most of these storylines do have to be closed off for these characters, because they won't be returning for Legacy, and I doubt we'll be returning to Chicago either. If there's a real battle in the streets for Chicago, there can only be one winner, because these guys have clearly shown they can't work together in the long run, especially if the CBI are in a war with the Marquez cartel. So for that reason, I do think Diamond is probably out of here as well. I just don't think how the CBI brothers survive if they're going up against Tommy, Miguel, and are also in a war with the Marquez cartel and also with law enforcement on their heels. So Janard and Diamond, I put the case forward for Diamond and Janard ending up on the hit list, or a case where Janard does actually end up in prison as well. Now there is one more character I just briefly wanted to touch on when it came to the CBI, and that's Marshall, D-Mac's right-hand man and brother. They did have their ups and downs back in season 1, in season 2 they were more of a unit, but in season 3 if Tommy is kicked out of the CBI, where does it leave DMAC and Marshall's relationship? Because clearly DMAC's loyalty will lay with his uncle. However, with Marshall, he's going to be with the CBI. You can see him in the background with the CBI just here. Again, you go back to the character developments of certain characters. Take Kanan in Raising Kanan for example. He's recently lost a lot of loved ones close to him. To name a few, D-Wiz, his father Detective Howard, even though there wasn't much of a relationship there was his best friend Famous, and then his girlfriend in Crystal. But those losses that he's had is partly the reason why he was the way he was, and the reason why he turned out the way he did in Power. Numb, cold, and emotionless. Losing loved ones definitely chips away at you piece by piece. Jukebox is another classic example. Bringing it back to DMAC, he's going to have to lose a lot more than just JP to really turn in the streets. He's going to have to go through it just like Kanan did, and just like Ghost and Tommy did. So, Marshall is someone who I can also see biting the dust, that just kind of adds to the pain for DMAC, and also adds to his character development. But next up, Shanti. Now, with Shanti, Gary Lennon has teased this as a character who is very strategic, but ultimately she's also there to service herself. She's a character who's going to have a counter move that will be just as brutal and surprising. And in the various teasers and trailers that I've shown you guys so far over the past 2 to 3 weeks, it only gives us a glimpse of what she's planning. She's warning Tommy to watch his back. She's warning him that the brothers are going to be looking out for themselves. But she's also someone who's going to be playing her own game behind Tommy's back. I have no doubt about that. And if there's anything we've learned in Power, if you play Tommy, lights out, game over. If you show him loyalty, he'll give it back to you tenfold, just like he did with Liliana. Now the game Shanti is playing, it's a very dangerous game to play when we know what Tommy Egan's done before in Power. Eventually you have to assume that Tommy will probably realize Shanti's been playing him for her own gain. Even if what she's saying is true, the brothers are looking out for themselves, he needs to watch his back around the CBI. Even if it is true, Shanti will definitely have her own agenda. She made it clear in season 2 that she wants to get rid of Tommy, she wants to get rid of Diamond, and then she wants to take over the organization. So I think there's only one end for a character like Shanti. I think she's a character that's going to be out of here. And I wouldn't be surprised if we maybe even get a B. Mickey Kato situation, just like we saw in BMF. Gary Lennon has teased the theme of blood being thicker than water for season 3, and if Shanti is hellbent on getting rid of Diamond, it's going to leave Janad in a very sticky situation. So if push comes to shove, I think Shanti's out of here at the hands of Janad. And even if it isn't Janad, a character like Shanti will always get what's coming to her. She's in the same mold as a character like Effie, Dre, Diana, in the sense she's a snake, she can't be trusted. And characters like the ones I've just mentioned, they gotta go. Diana and Effie, the moment they betrayed Tariq in the way that they did, if Tariq really was on smoke, he should have just got rid of both of them in season 4. He was talking about I've got bullets for all the Tahadas while he was in jail, but he then went and got betrayed by them yet again, when history proved none of these guys could ever be trusted. In my opinion, Tariq was genuinely on some bitch shit. But anyway, before I go off on a tangent on Book 2 Ghost, Shanti's in the same mold as those types of characters, and for that reason, she definitely is on the hit list. Now, for law enforcement, they're definitely going to be playing a big role in season 3, that's for sure. In every teaser and trailer that we've seen, Stacey Marks is in there with the thick of the action, so is Stacey's husband Bobby DeFranco, but they're not immune to the 3 scenarios either. In fact, there is another category when it comes to law enforcement, and that's suspension. We've seen law enforcement officers being killed off before, we've seen some being questioned where they were at risk themselves of being put in an orange jumpsuit. We've had characters like Jenny Sullivan leave New York, and we've seen many being suspended during our time on Power. Angela, Cooper Sachs, Joe Proctor, Davis McLean, that's just to name a few. So there are a few scenarios with how it could actually end up with those guys with badges. With Stacey Marks and Bobby DeFranco, this white sheet that he lifted up here, this did look personal. This does look like a victim that he knows. It doesn't mean that it's Stacey Marks, but I wouldn't be surprised if at least either one of Bobby DeFranco or Stacey Marks do bite the dust, one or the other. We can make a very strong argument where Stacey Marks could also end up being suspended, because I do think she may be a character who will bend the law to get what she wants. For example, bending the law using Vic Flynn. We saw how Cooper Sachs used Lindsay Proctor back in Power to plant the recording device which was off the books. Again, he also used Dre to plant Terry Silver's phone in his apartment. I wouldn't be surprised to see Stacey Marks doing something very similar. So, could that result in her suspension? Just like the other storylines, the chapter for law enforcement that also needs to be closed off one way or another as well. And this is one where I want to tie in the crossover theory. Blanca Rodriguez was looking at the chaos in Chicago before, and I do wonder if Stacey Marks either ends up dead or in jail, suspended, or whatever else. If that's the catalyst that kind of brings her into the picture, and that's the way we get the crossover. I do think the most likely scenario of a crossover, besides Tariq of course, is law enforcement, because they have dropped the breadcrumbs before. Blanca Rodriguez and Jenny Sullivan are two characters who I could see popping up either at the end of Force or maybe even in Power Legacy. I honestly don't think we've seen the last of either Blanca Rodriguez or Jenny Sullivan. As for Stacey Marks and Bobby DeFranco's fates come the end of Season 3, they probably won't die. I'd lean more towards suspension, or rather them having egg on their faces and being played by Vic and Tommy. But regardless, it's going to be a very fun cat and mouse game, that's for sure. Now there are also a bunch of others. There are a few groups of characters we do need to keep in mind. Markovic and the Serbs. Even though they were arrested at the end of Season 2, they can easily write them back into the story. And with Markovic and the Serbs, they are characters that can easily add to the bloodbath. Markovic isn't this big scary Serb who has an aura like Lobos, Milan, or even Jason Mičić. He can easily add to the bloodbath. There's also Elise, Claudia's girlfriend, or ex-girlfriend if Claudia is dead. She can be someone who bites the dust being involved in this world. The Yardies. I made reference to them in my breakdown. We've still not seen Zamost, the leader of the Yardies, but the way these guys are behaving, they're definitely going to be wiped off the map. And then there's also various other guys who are going to be caught in the crosshairs. There's definitely going to be a lot of street soldiers or just general people who get caught in the crossfire. There'll definitely be plenty of those, that's for sure. But that brings me to the end of the death predictions. On the hit list, we have JP. Kate and DMAC I have surviving. We've got Claudia Flynn with a big question mark. We need the answers to her character in episode 1. Otherwise, if we've not heard anything about Claudia in episode 1 or 2, I will be saying she's alive. Vic Flynn is someone who I have surviving, the same with Miguel and Morel. We've also got Jannard in 2 sections with a huge question mark. Either he ends up dead, or I do think it would be quite funny to see him behind bars. Diamond is definitely also on the hit list, along with various other members of the CBI. That also includes Marshall. With Shanti, she's definitely out of here too, along with Markovic and the Serbs, the Yardies, Elise, and various other street soldiers from every single crew. With law enforcement, I am going to put Stacey Marks in a question mark because of this scene here with Bobby DeFranco, but it is always very difficult with law enforcement. Now with that being said, the floor is now yours. Drop me your thoughts on not just death predictions, but also those guys you think will survive, go to prison, or maybe in the case of law enforcement, be suspended. Drop all your thoughts down below in the comment section, and as always, thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you next time.